YouTubers! My name's Willie, and welcome to my channel. Today I have for you Reaction Request 209. This is the Furious Abyss, part of Arch Warhammer's Horus Heresy lore breakdown. Was originally requested by CJ Falcon. Let's get right into the reaction. Yeah. And 3, 2, 1, play. Da 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 da. Greetings.
Salutations, friends, and welcome to yet more Horus Heresy lore rundowns. Today we are on Book 8 of the Horus Heresy, The Battle for the Abyss. This one has less truly big lore tidbits, so it should be a relatively short one.
Nice.
So, first off, the Word Bearers are finally starting to show their real colours. This is the first book in the series where we really get a look at them as the villains, and also one of the first books where we get to see the legions fighting each other from the get-go. This is not a betrayal, this is one legion meeting another in hostility, and indeed the Word Bearers acting with open hostility against the Imperium right from the get-go. But of course, the main star of this particular book is not the Word Bearers nor the Ultramarines, or indeed the Space Wolves or World Eaters, nor even really the Mechanicum. It is the ship itself, the Furious Abyss, the largest ship to have ever been constructed inside the Imperium. It was constructed inside Thule, a massive asteroid in wide orbit around Jupiter under extreme secrecy. Now, this one is a little bit interesting to me because this ship was massive, and we know that some of the largest ships in the Imperium have taken decades, if not centuries, to build. And yet, the book makes it sound as if the Furious Abyss was built with the knowledge of Horus and the cooperation of his little lackeys on Mars themselves. Which seems odd, because this ship would have taken decades at the very least. And in all due likelihood, it would have had to have been planned for decades as well, considering all of the new technology mounted on it. It's a little bit hard to determine precisely how time passes in the Horus Heresy series, but this does not seem to be entirely congruent with what we know so far. There's no suggestion that Horus spent decades between the events with the Interax and towards the final betrayal of his legion, so I'm not entirely sure how this happened. Perhaps this was somehow constructed on Lorgar's authority, because we do know that he turned traitor long before anyone else, but there is no proper mention of that in the book, as far as I could tell. One other possibility, though, is that this might have been somehow the work of the Dark Gods, via their Mechanicus puppet, Cerebrol Hal. Now, he had been operating in secret and in accordance with Horus from the very get-go, but it is not impossible to imagine that Lorgar might have gotten his claws in him long before that again, but even then, I gotta say, the whole Furious Abyss being constructed in complete secrecy, etc., does sound a little bit suspicious, but maybe I'm missing something. It is possible that this gets explained later on in the series, which a lot of it I have read, but I can't remember a specific moment where they explain precisely why or how this came to be. So for the moment, we're simply going to assume that the Word Bearers had something to do with it. After all, they had already named a captain, Zad Keel, and he had already been well briefed about his role in this particular plan. We also know that at the very least parts of the plan was already incorporated in the Word, Lorgar's secret writings, which means that he probably had made these plans possibly even decades ago. And we also know that the chapter that was stationed on the Furious Abyss, the so-called Quillborn, was specialized Marines. So there was definitely a fair bit of planning going into this, unquestionably. I don't know if Lorgar would have had the authority to set this in motion, at the very least not this secretly, but again, we'll just assume this was Lorgar's doing for now. So, after the construction of the ship, obviously no word could be allowed to spread about it, and so Thule, on the orders of Kerbal Harl, was destroyed, covertly, by a massive explosion. This would of course undoubtedly draw some notice, but it was after all a relatively minor shipyard with no major ongoing projects, again suggesting that the construction of the Furious Abyss was completely secret, and so it would take months before any investigation could be compiled, and any even slight kind of warning would have been possible, and even after the investigation, all they could really tell was, well, there was a massive explosion. No reason to go like, hey, there was probably a massive secret warship here.
Yeah.
The secret was
Yeah, it would sound
we also know
pretty
from
odd.
this that the Woodbearers must have had puppets within other Imperial organizations as well. Now, at this point in time, Horus had very recently issued his orders to Gilliman to mass on Calth, where he would join up with the Wordbearers to prosecute the Orcs in the Viridian sector. As such, ultramarine forces from all over the Imperium was massing towards Calth. One of these forces, under the command of the ultramarine captain Hector, was ambushed and destroyed by the Furious Abyss. Now, of course, it is possible that the Furious Abyss simply just checked the logs and saw, well, the Ultramarines are expected to be in roughly this coordinate at this time, because of course at this point in time they still had direct access to the Imperium's records, or they might have had some kind of spy in place, because they were clearly waiting for the Ultramarines. They were indeed using the fleet under Hector as a testing bed for many of their new weapons, including their use of psychic supplicants to shield their ship from detection. Normally, a vessel the size of the Furious Abyss would not be particularly stealthy. However, through esoteric means, the slave psychers of the Wordbearers managed to baffle the various sensors in Hector's fleet and approached until almost point-blank range before revealing itself and gutting the Ultramarine fleet in a few devastating broadsides of its massive lance batteries. And make no mistake, this ship was absolutely gargantuan. The biggest ship ever produced in the Imperium, much, much bigger than even an Astartes battle barge or an Emperor-class battleship. Additionally, it was chock full of cutting-edge mechanical tech. Its main weapon was a plasma lance, a weapon capable of unleashing a devastating torrent of liquid plasma at a huge range, although, as far as space combat was concerned, it was a relatively short-range weapon, therefore requiring the baffling powers of the Psychers. Once the weapon was in range, however, and fired, the ship would reveal one further stratagem. The thrusters down one side of the ship would all fire simultaneously, with the effect of the plasma lance, which lived only for a handful of seconds, being swept across space, allowing it to play its full devastating power across an entire ship, or potentially even across multiple enemy ships, which would almost certainly cripple them instantaneously. Additionally, it had access to a new and interesting type of torpedo. Now, the word torpedo is a little bit misleading in 40k. What it really means is a gargantuan missile, something the size of an intercontinental ballistic missile being fired in large volleys, usually from a ship's prow. These will then cross the distance between the ships, and they will be able to pass through the void shields. Void shields are good at dispersing energy, but they're only good at dispersing relatively large quantities of energy. This means that the kinetic energy of a torpedo, or indeed a mass driver strike, is not enough to truly activate the shield, which means that torpedoes can pass right through the void shields without any real problem.
Wow.
This makes them an excellent shipping weapon. Regular torpedoes simply work with a delayed action fuse. The torpedo hammers into the ship's hull, then continues on with the power of its engines and sheer kinetic energy as far into the ship as it can go, And then, after a certain time has passed, the warhead itself will detonate, hopefully deep within the enemy ship, causing crippling damage. In the case of the Furious Abyss's torpedoes, however, they would carry out this action as the first phase. After they had buried themselves deep within the ships, the warhead would then detach from the main torpedo into several smaller torpedoes, which would then be fired from the main warhead into the ship using drilling mechanisms
massive
to
damage.
bury their way deeper inside of the vessel and then detonate. Essentially, it was a form of drill-tipped cluster munition. This was by no stretch of the imagination standard Mechanicus tech. Indeed, it was not even known to the vast majority of the Imperium. This suggests one out of two things. Either it was a new invention created by the Mechanicus directly under Kerbral Hall and was technological in nature, or it might have had some heretical warp components. We do, for example, know that there are large storages of so-called heretical weapons stored under Mars. It is possible that this weapon was to some degree machine sentient. It might, for example, have had a measure of an AI presence inside of it, which is completely and utterly outlawed in the Imperium. And in this case, the weapon must have been capable of, to at least a limited degree, of making decisions and maneuvering by itself without the direct input of a human operator, which might just be enough to put it within the Imperium's ban on artificial intelligence. Or,
Nice.
as mentioned, it might have a warp component. It would not surprise me, seeing as Kerbral Hall's Dark Mechanicus was most definitively deep within the mysteries of the warp themselves.
Nice.
Additionally, the Furious Abyss had one further trick up its sleeve. It was capable of supporting attack craft. This was deemed to be impossible for a ship of that size and armament. It simply would require far too much energy storage, and far too much space to also be able to house attack craft, which in all due likelihood means that this technology was considerably more advanced and therefore also smaller, allowing the Mechanicus to fit more stuff on the ship. Now again, I suspect this is mostly just a technological achievement, which in many cases the Imperium was a little bit afraid of making. Not because at this point in time they were afraid of technological achievement in and of themselves, but simply because they had another priority. Here's the thing. Whenever you make a groundbreaking technological achievement within military, and you are at war, deploying that technology is going to be ridiculously expensive. First and foremost, you need to, of course, change production lines from producing one proven piece of technology to producing the new piece of technology. That alone is a fairly large operation. Then you need to reorganize supply lines to supply that new piece of technology, along with any replacement parts that it might require. Additionally, of course, you also need to educate people in the new ways of producing it, etc., etc. It is very, very, very expensive, and rarely done unless that new piece of technology is going to have a considerable impact upon the war effort. Essentially, in the Imperium, this was only really prioritized for supplies to the Legion Astartes, since they were relatively few in numbers, and they of course represented the absolute spear tip of the Imperium. In other words, this technology might not have been heretical at all, it was simply deemed to be too expensive to be deployed, and therefore the Mechanicus had been denied their request to continue research and production, which would almost certainly have gone against the basic tenets of the Mechanicus at the time, who of course considered the pursuit of knowledge to be more important than anything else. So again, this doesn't necessarily have to be warp tech, it might be, it might even be vaguely heretical in nature, but
makes
it might
sense.
also not be. What it does,
Makes
however,
sense.
mean is that one of the main weaknesses of the Furious Abyss was overcome. Now, the Furious Abyss in and of itself was not a particularly viable design for a frontline battleship. It was simply too goddamn large. Its armor was monstrously overwrought, and was capable of eating up a ridiculous amount of punishment while dishing it out. However, a ship that large is always going to be very, very vulnerable in a pitched naval engagement, as the enemy will undoubtedly realize that it is a big target and it is dangerous, and therefore focus fire on it. Additionally, it made itself a huge target for enemy attack aircraft. And indeed, later on in the book, it gets attacked by exactly that form of weapon, but only managed to avoid taking severe damage due to once again the deployment of its supplicants. We'll get to that in a moment, but basically, this was not really a viable design for a battleship. But that, of course, was also not actually its purpose at all. The Furious Abyss had been designed and built with one specific purpose in mind. It was to approach the planet of Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines, and destroy the moon Formosa. This would create a massive asteroid storm that would sweep in over Macragge, hopefully annihilating the fleet stationed above Macragge, and after that, the Furious Abyss, using its massive amount of frontal armor, would descend towards the planet itself, soaking up the defense laser batteries on the planet below, which were formidable, make no mistake, and then unleash its payload of virus bombs onto the surface of Macragge. Now, virus bombs is something we've already talked about, but I'll briefly go over what it is. It is a chemical weapon of possibly heretical and maybe even warp origins. It is essentially an extremely virulent bacterial strain capable of eating anything. It will literally dissolve all matter at the molecular level, ripping it apart and turning it into disgusting, rotting sludge. It would reduce Armageddon
Gross.
to a sea of rotting offal. After which, the Furious Abyss would fire its lance batteries into the upper atmosphere, which would ignite the now highly saturated atmosphere and cause planet-wide firestorms to wipe out any life that might have survived the virus bombs, thusly cleansing Macragge utterly in the name of the word. In all due likelihood, the defense laser batteries of Macragge would have crippled and possibly even destroyed the Furious Abyss in this action, but they would almost certainly not have been able to prevent it from letting its weapons do their horrifying work. The plan after that was for the Ultramarines at Calth to receive word that an unidentified ship had caused a massive disaster on Macragge. This in return would cause Guilliman to take large portions of the fleet near Macragge and possibly even some of the Legion and head towards Macragge to help. This would allow Cor Ferron to fall upon the remainder of the Ultramarine Legion and their fleet and wipe it out entirely. In one single blow, the Ultramarine Legion would have been utterly and completely crippled, and the few Ultramarine forces that remained under the command of Guilliman would be virtually helpless in the face of the combined offensive that was launched into Ultramar by the Wordbearers and the World Eaters. It was quite the audacious plan. It bet a lot on the success of the Furious Abyss. A single ship, a massive and godly well-armed and armored ship, true, but still, that was one hell of a gamble.
Yeah.
Granted, the potential payoff was equally monstrous, and it very well might have worked if it was not for the actions of another Ultramarine captain by the name of Cestus and 1,000 son by the name of Motep. And I want to talk a little bit about Motep in particular because he is a rather interesting little character. He had used his powers of foresight to see the Furious Abyss. Probably not exactly what it was, and probably not exactly what its purpose was, but he knew enough about it that it would probably be bad. He also knew that Cestus would place himself in the path of whatever bad thing was heading for whatever bad destination. It's a little bit vague, but then again, the Thousand Sons' predictions are often a little bit hazy, shall we say. As such, he decided to join his forces with those of Cestus, who himself had simply raked together a scratch fleet of whatever things was available to him at the time. The reason for this mobilization was that the fleet commanded by Hector had managed to get away one last emergency message, which had been able to warn Cestus and the Scratch fleets that he was gathering up that something was very, very wrong, because, well, generally speaking, ultramarine fleets don't just up and disappear randomly.
Yes.
Especially not in a way that would leave
Whole
a echoing
fleets.
death scream reverberating through the immaterium. They did find what was wrong. They found the Furious Abyss, but the tiny Scratch fleet had very little chance of the Furious Abyss. Their one hope was the strike craft contained aboard one of the ships. The Furious Abyss was a massive target, and as such, a close-range assault by assault craft launching torpedoes into it would have been devastating. However, once again, the Furious Abyss's supplicants were used to launch a psychic attack against the assault crafts, corrupting and driving insane some of the crew members. This very quickly led to all manner of order and organization breaking down, and forcing the attack crafts to break off the assault. This saved the Furious Abyss and gave it enough time to annihilate the ship that had launched them. Luckily for the Imperium, Motep, although having his ship destroyed, managed to survive due to the fact that he of course was in his full armor, which is void hardened. Cestus also survived by sheer virtue of not being on one of the ships hit. But again, I want to talk a little bit more about Motep. So as I mentioned, he knew that Cestus would be a focal point in this. This was also after the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor put a ban on all use of psychic powers, and yes, Motep had clearly used psychic powers to figure this out. Additionally, when the Scratch fleet tried to follow the Furious Abyss into the warp, and was attacked by yet another of the Furious Abyss weapons, a psionic mine, which is simply a giant metal sphere dumped into the warp, unprotected and filled with psychers, and then detonated. The Scratch fleet to get invaded once again by
Oh,
demons,
jeez.
and Motep used his psionic powers to chase them away, again in clear violations of Nicaea. This, unsurprisingly, made his fellow Astartes a little bit suspicious about him, and he was thrown in the brig. And this was not the last time that Motep would use his psionic powers to great effect, and indeed, I would say, mission-critical effect.
Nice.
Despite the constant censure and threats of violence and death at the hands of his fellow Astartes. Why would he do this? Well, the thing is, the Thousand Sons are loyalists. They were desperate to remain loyal. They tried everything they could to remain loyal. Magnus was at one point, and we'll get to that in his own little episode, and the book of course, willing to sacrifice himself and his entire legion in the hopes that he could remain loyal. Motep wanted to show the son of Macragge, the stout, brave and unbending ultramarines, that they needed psychers. Unfortunately for him, the ultramarines also have absolutely massive and unbending sticks rammed up their assholes at all times, and merely rescuing said ultramarine and his mission from certain death half a dozen times is not enough to remove said stick. Even then, I find it admirable that he made the effort, and he specifically put his life on the line purely to try and convince some small fraction of Guilliman's Legion to understand the value of psychers. Of course, it wasn't successful because of aforementioned stick, but oh well, nice try. As mentioned also, the Scratch fleet tried to follow the Furious Abyss after the engagement, but were hindered by demons. However, the Scratch fleet had managed to inflict a certain level of damage on the Furious Abyss, although this damage was more due to Zadkiel, the captain of the Furious Abyss, rather than the Scratch fleet. Zadkiel had simply just faced his ship head-on against the attackers and allowed them to bombard the Furious Abyss for an extended period of time, even though he could have wiped them out. He did this purely to demonstrate his superiority and to stroke his own ego. Unfortunately for Zadkiel, one of those rounds had managed to find its way through all of the armor plating and do two very important things. One, it had managed to collapse an area of the Furious Abyss, cutting off a vast fuel bunker from the rest of the ship. This, in all due likelihood, was one of the forward plasma engines. Without access to it, the ship would lose a lot of its output. Additionally, one of the main coolant tanks aboard the Furious Abyss had ruptured. This meant the Furious Abyss could not run its remaining engines to a level where they would be able to stay ahead of their pursuers, as any effort to do so would overheat the plasma reactors, resulting in boom. And they could not shift the load off the main reactors because the other reactors were isolated and could not be properly connected with. This meant that the Furious Abyss had to stop at the shipyards of Bacca Triumvirate before continuing on to Macragge. This allowed the Scratch fleet, along with its Astartes contingent, to catch up to the Furious Abyss and launch a surprise attack on the ship as it was in dock. Unfortunately, the assault failed, due in no small part to the World Eaters under the command of a captain by the name of Skral. Skral encouraged his World Eaters to butcher any and all living creatures they came across on their way to the ship after having infiltrated the shipyard. This, of course, meant that as menials and servitors were butchered indiscriminately, some kind of warning, quite obviously, would be sent up to the command bridge, which was currently occupied, of course, by the Word Bearers. This gave them plenty of warning, and allowed Zadkiel to organize a counter-assault that kept the Astartes off the ship, or, well, most of them at the very least. While elements of the Word Bearers had been sent out of the ship to deal with the Legionnaires, the ship itself left dock, abandoning several of the Word Bearers on the platform. This was done not strictly through necessity, since, after all, the Furious Abyss had an entire chapter aboard it. It, in all due likelihood, could easily have crushed the Loyalists after they had lost the element of surprise. But instead of simply deploying something like half the Quillborn chapter, Zadkiel decided to flee, partially because he knew that in doing so, he would leave behind certain Word-bearers that he simply did not like.
Ooh.
And this is where we get into the Word-bearers themselves.
Nice.
One of the first interesting little mentions of the Word-bearers we get to see in the Horus Heresy. The Word-bearers were fractured. Zadkiel, for example, highly mistrusted large portions of his command, and in particular, one up-and-coming young acolyte, which was one of the many Word-bearers left outside the Furious Abyss as it left. We also get to see the command structure splinter under the weight of personal ambition. Zadkiel had compromised the mission by allowing the Furious Abyss to simply soak up the punishment from the Scratch fleet to begin with. This was pure and simple an act of self-aggrandizement. Zadkiel wanted to feel good about his big, beautiful ship being so much better than those petty loyalist lapdogs, and he of course refused to take any responsibility for his actions when it became apparent that the ship could not continue towards its destination without a pit stop at Bacca, which would end up biting the ship in the arse to an absolutely marvelous degree. In fact, we even come so far as to see open insurrection within the Word-bearers. After Zadkiel had messed up a couple more times, the chaplain on board drew his bolt pistol on Zadkiel, the captain, and ordered him to step down. Zadkiel then killed the chaplain. This is rather unheard of within the Legion Astartes up until this point. They have always been unified, if nothing else, by a sense of brotherhood within the Legion. Legion brothers killing each other, mistrusting each other, and actively working against each other like this was almost a completely unknown phenomenon at that point in time. I will save the proper speculations as to how and why for the Word-bearers lore video, but it is clear that already in this relatively early stage of the Crusade, the Word-bearers were starting to collapse in on themselves. However, it is also clear that they still do have a certain zealous and fanatical loyalty, if nothing else, towards Lorgar and the Word. one of the word bearers left after the Furious Abyss had made its escape had been captured by Bringard, the Space Wolf, and was treated to the full hospitality of Fenris. Something tells me that the poor word bearer wished he had gotten killed rather than captured. However, despite the gentle treatment that Bringard treated the poor motherfucker to, he did not break. He did not reveal the ultimate purpose of the Furious Abyss or the plans of Zadkiel and, of course, Lorgard by extension. This is pretty damn impressive, because Space Wolves can be pretty
persuasive,
convincing once they're beating the shit out of you with their superhuman fists. However, this is where Motep once again steps back into the story. He had been occupying a cell at this point in time due to his actions of saving the Scratch fleet, thereby making himself in violation of Nikeah. Now, you remember when I said the Ultramarines are stuck-up little bastards, and yeah, they definitely are. They are self-important, self-righteous, and a little bit cuntish. And they will quite happily compromise their own ideals if they think it is correct. This is one of the main reasons why I kinda don't like the Ultramarines. They claim and pretend to be absolutely virtuous. Even in this case, Cestus goes to Motep, asks him to break the word bearer using psychic means, he must have known that, and then tells Motep that afterwards he will court-martial Motep for using psychic powers. Fuck you, Cestus, you douchebag, is all I can really say to that.
Wow.
And Motep, being the good guy that he actually is, and I really do like the Thousand Sons, to be honest, they really are the underdog victims in the Horus Heresy, aren't they? Poor bastards. Anyways, he does what Bringar could not. He breaks the word bearer psychically and extracts his secrets, along, of course, with the Furious Abyss's final objective from his mind. This gets Cestus rather worked up, as this would probably mean the destruction of his entire legion. Unsurprisingly, that's a bad thing. You'd think this would be the point where Cestus would simply go, well, Motep, I think we're going to need you, because not using you might get my entire legion destroyed. Instead, he simply just throws Motep back inside his prison cell. God damn it, you Ultra Smurf, you know that's a bad idea, and yet, well, they did it anyways. Luckily for them, however, the Furious Abyss had not been able to fully complete its repairs, which allowed what remained of the Loyalists to keep up with it, and catch up with the Furious Abyss near Macragge. They launched one last desperate assault upon the Furious Abyss as it was preparing to fire cyclonic torpedoes at the moon of Formasca. They prevented the launch by launching shuttles directly at the torpedo chambers, trying to board the Furious Abyss via its open torpedo hangars. This was a success, meaning that the launch had to be aborted so as to not allow the Loyalists to place explosive charges on the cyclonic torpedoes, because these things are world killers. A volley of cyclonics is the kind of stuff you use to bust open a planet. If they went boof inside the Furious Abyss, nobody really cares how big the ship is. It would go away very, very quickly. There wouldn't even be a whole lot left to say that it had ever existed in the first place. The problem now, of course, that there was a bunch of Loyalists aboard the Furious Abyss, including one World Eater, Skral, who had managed to get onto the ship during the failed boarding operations at Baka. He now joined up with the rest of the Loyalists that had managed to get on board and started wreaking some serious havoc. Although, again, it was a very close-run thing. The Furious Abyss unleashed the rest of its supplicants against the borders, launching a massive psychic attack against the Loyalists. This, amongst other things, caused Bringar to murder all of his brother brothers in a fit of rage, as he imagined himself to be a wolf back on Fenris, where he tore out the throats of his packmates. Oh, if just they had had some way of preventing this, like, I don't know, or something, but sadly they didn't have any of those. The one they did have was still stuck back on the main ship that was expected to be annihilated by the Furious Abyss, after the shuttles had made it into the cyclonic torpedo launch bays. Ah, Cestus, you prudish cunt. Now, honestly, I'm going to go so far as to literally bitch Cestus out on this. He knowingly and willfully jeopardized the mission. He knew that the Furious Abyss was capable of launching psychic attacks. He had already been exposed to them something like 20 times. And indeed, most of those times, Motep was the very one that had saved their asses. And yet, at this last do-or-die gamble, he decides to keep Motep back in the fucking brig. Stupid, Smith. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Luckily for Motep, at least he didn't have to be too bored. The Word Bearers had one final ace up their sleeve. A demon by the name of Vizoric, or at least that was the name he gave to the Word Bearers. Sacrificing the few supplicants they had left after the assault on the Loyalists, they managed to manifest this demon on the bridge of the last remaining Loyalist vessel. The demon swiftly butchered all of the command crews and would in all due likelihood have butchered everyone aboard their ship and returned to the Furious Abyss to take on the Loyalist Marines if it was not for Motep, that sacrificed his own life in holding the demon back on the last Loyalist ship for long enough to detonate the ship itself and annihilate himself and the demon in the process. Without Motep, the Word-Bearers would almost certainly have succeeded in their plans, and the Ultramarine Legion would almost certainly have been wiped out. Without the Thousand Sons and their selfless sacrifice in this particular action, the Horus Heresy would almost certainly have come to a considerably different end. But before we start speculating too much on that, let us return to the Furious Abyss. Zadkiel was finally made aware of the fact that Loyalists were running rampant aboard his ship, and went to try and deal with them. And if it was just Bringar and just Cestus, maybe he would have been able to do so. However, Skral had been running loose on the Furious Abyss for quite some time at this point, and Zadkiel had had multiple opportunities to kill him. However, he had chosen not to, because he wanted to demonstrate his superiority to the World Eater, even going so far as at one point when he had him dead to right, under video surveillance, unknown to Skrull at the time, and had him potentially surrounded, instead of simply killing the World Eater, he chose to taunt him, talking about how his brothers had already joined the Heresy, how his Primarch had already joined forces with Lorgar, even showing him one of Angron's favored weapons sitting in the Furious Abyss. This weapon, a monstrous chain axe forged from the body of a dead alien, was too massive for Skrull to wield. However, it was massive enough for him to shatter the ornamental casing in which it lay, rev the weapon up, throw it at the wall, and have it buckle in the entire goddamn wall, allowing Skrull once again to escape. And so, through the combined strength of Bringar the Space Wolf, Skrull the World Eater, and Cestus the Ultra Smurf Idiot, they managed to fight their way all the way to the reactor engine of the Furious Abyss. They managed to break their way into the reactor, where Bringar, in all due likelihood feeling the guilt start welling up over the fact that he had eaten all of his little friends, took the last explosives available to them and threw himself into the plasma reactor's core, detonating the grenades on the way down. This caused a cataclysmic series of reactor malfunctions, leading to a major meltdown in all of the ship's systems, as the various other reactors struggled to make up the loss of power, failed, and then began struggling to hold back the tides of plasma that were beginning to vent throughout the ship, failed, and then finally began to collapse in turn, until the Furious Abyss finally vanished in one final massive supernova explosion, taking all aboard with it, including Zadkiel and Cestus, who had fought it out on the escape pod deck of the Furious Abyss. Zadkiel had decided to once again try to save himself. However, Cestus put a stop to that, and he killed Zadkiel in a final confrontation moments before the Furious Abyss went boof. Formaska remained in the skies of Macragge. The Ultramarine fleet was not destroyed, and so the Ultramarines gathered on Calth had no reason to go anywhere. The Furious Abyss and Lorgar's plans had failed. This meant that Corferon's surprise attack on Calth would not face a divided legion. Instead, they would have to take on the entirety of the Ultramarines' legion. It was not to be the slaughter they had been promised. Instead, it was to be a...
Yeah, it's going to be
the word
a challenge
had the
now.
overwhelming advantage of complete and utter surprise, but they did not have the numbers. For reasons that we will discover later on in Horus Heresy series, Lorgar had sent just enough word-bearers to Calth to deal with a weakened Ultramarines legion. Exactly why the Lord of the Word-bearers had chosen to take such a gamble, well, perhaps it was not a gamble at all. But we will get into that much, much later, I'm afraid. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.
Thank you, Arch. No outro. Okay, so that was Arch Warhammer's lore breakdown for Horus Heresy book series. This was the Furious Abyss. If you want to see Arch Warhammer stuff, there's a link in the description to go help you find Arch's things so that you can check them out for yourself. Quite a bit of lore, some gameplay, pretty cool stuff. Let's talk about what was discussed and what I learned. Okay, so this was book 8. We learned about the word bearers, but the main star was apparently the Furious Abyss as a ship. Made under secret. They even, assuming that the word bearers were involved because of when it happened to come out, time-wise. They apparently had a Quill-born Marines in it. They destroyed it, or destroyed its dock to eliminate its records, essentially. It had many weapons, such as a plasma lance, the ability to move to make the lance stretch over a long distance, or like a line to cut through a ship. Ballistic missiles that could dig into a ship and then launch several missiles from it, as well as many things like a mine filled with psychers. Those poor psychers. Just launch a box full of people into the warp and then detonate it. Oh, and several virus bombs apparently, as well as being massive, having its own attack craft, and having extensive amounts of armor. Apparently, the actual plan for the ship was designed for one purpose, and that was to destroy a moon in the Ultramar system, have the Ultramarines send a good portion of their men to investigate, and then destroy them, making the Ultramarines much less of a threat, which makes sense. Apparently there was an entire fleet that had been destroyed just as a test But apparently, Motep, a Thousand Son, had gotten with Cestus, and they built a scratch fleet, and they went to investigate what the psychic Motep had been feeling, essentially, and they found, as well as a slight distress signal from that ship that fleet that had been destroyed. Apparently, the Abyss was using psychics attacks to destroy the attack ships that were going after it when they went into the first conflict. Damage was created extensive enough that they had to dock later and repair. Meanwhile, they threw Motep in the brig, found the Abyss. They attacked the Abyss, but the Abyss had some warning, so it was able to get out of there, leaving behind some of the word bearers that the particular captain didn't like too much. And Motep had been used to crack a word bearer's mentally to figure out his secrets, what the Abyss was intended to do. So they sent the Scratch Fleet after this massive beast of a ship. Motep still being used as a tool and being thrown in the brig. Pretty much left for his death because they end up getting in the ship through the torpedo tubes, which stopped the tubes from being fired, or stopped the missiles from being fired, but all the ships were destroyed by all sorts of... It was only a scratch fleet to start with. The last ship, they ended up creating or bringing forth a demon and summoning it on the other ship. And Motep ended up sacrificing himself and destroying the ship. But it allowed a World Eater who was being taunted by the captain of the ship, because the captain of the ship was all, self-righteous, self-gloating, if you would. And eventually, Motep has already sacrificed himself. The World Eater and Cestus managed to dig deep down into the ship, as well as, I think there was a wolf as well. But it seemed like there was 3 of them. And Cestus ended up fighting at the very end the captain of the Abyss. So as it was destroyed, he had his victory. Which is great, for being such a jerk to Motep. And anyway, but I believe it was the World Eater that ended up chucking himself with grenades into the reactor core, which sent the entire Abyss into a meltdown because of all its plasma weaponry. And so, the day is saved. Thanks to a ragtag team. Huzzah! Anyways, again, this was Arch Warhammer's lore breakdown of this book. Link in description. I think I'm gonna leave it at that. Willie, out.
If you liked the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to leave a comment. Have a good one. Looks like we're back.